So while we talk about this, how public agencies operationalize consent under the DPDP Act for the essential citizen services. There are a lot of essential services for citizens. So how do they operationalize consent under this?
I think very good question. That's something that they're all grappling with. But I would frame this by saying the very first question they should ask themselves is consent even required? And I say that because a common mistake that public agencies might make when approaching DPDP is to treat consent as a default. They'll design elaborate consent flows for services where consent may not be necessary, otherwise, is legally may not be necessary. So before building any consent mechanism or infrastructure, I think agencies must understand the fundamental divide this act creates. So there's basically section 6 and 7 of the DPDP Act that they have to look at. Section 6 establishes consent as a lawful ground for processing. Section 7 enumerates legitimate use categories of processing that actually require no consent because the legal basis already exists. For example, delivery of subsidies, benefits, licenses, etc. Personal data is either volunteered by the citizen or it's collected under a statutory mandate. So in practice, this means that core data processing behind some of India's largest citizen-facing programs like Aadhaar seeding for DBT transfer, ration card issuance under the National Food Security Act, or pension disbursement under NPS scheme, or various other schemes. All of these generally fall under Section 7. So there's already a legal basis. So the statutory scheme itself is the lawful basis. So that's something government agencies have to first look at. There's no need to layer consent mechanism on top of these programs. That would not mean that they're being more compliant or something. They're actually creating operational friction without the legal necessity. And in some cases may inadvertently be implying that citizen participation is optional when actually it is not. So what this actually means is that they must develop a record of processing activities, a ROPA as we call it, and map that to every data collection and processing activity to either a Section 6 consent ground or a specific Section 7 legitimate use provision. This is very important. Consent architecture must be built only for what remains unaccounted for after Section 7 is exhausted. So when you're when you're building consent, if you decide that, okay, this is where I need to build consent, then there are certain standards that the DPDP Act specifies. So one is that it has to be free. It cannot be bundled with service conditions. A citizen cannot be told that their consent to data analytics is required to access a portal. That's not acceptable. So the core and the ancillary processing must be technically disaggregated. They cannot be combined. The second part of consent is that it must be informed. It must be delivered through a clear, plain language notice that explains what data is being collected, for what purpose, and for how long. The third is that it has to be granular per purpose. So not a single consent checkbox covering 10 different users. That would be considered non-compliant. Also, unambiguous. This is, you have to require an affirmative action. This is what government agencies really must think about. You can't have pre-ticked boxes, which is implied consent through continued use or silence as consent. These are all would be considered non-compliant. I'll give you an example. In California, for example, they have this opt-in and opt-out kind of a model. Yeah, where always they have a link in any government portal or anything that you can go and you have to opt in for what you want. So none of the boxes are ticked. You have to opt in for what are the things that you want. The other approach is opt out, where everything is pre-ticked and you opt out of which services you don't want. So the tendency would be to be opt out because that's easier to implement. But I would say that government organizations should actually go for opt-in. It may be a little more difficult to probably operationalize, but that you will be more compliant in the long run if you go for opt-in. Also, a citizen can withdraw consent. So they have to make sure that they have a mechanism whereby a citizen can also withdraw consent. Now here, it can't be just, that they withdraw it. That withdrawal of consent must cascade downstream to everywhere that data is being processed, even if it's going outside one ministry, if you're sending it to another ministry or another government body. So that's another thing they have to be very careful about. It's not just within their system, but also where it's going downstream. And then another important thing is the language. A lot of our government portals are generally non-compliant when you look at language. DPDP rules require consent notices to be available not only in English, but in any of the 22 languages in our 8th schedule of the Constitution. So a single English language PDF notice does not meet the requirement. So you have to build dynamic language aware notice deliveries depending on what languages are required in your region. And so that's another thing that has to be looked at. So basically what this means is that to operationalize the consent, you need something like a consent manager, which is like a registered intermediary through which citizens can give, review, withdraw consent. This is a significant structural addition that government organizations that currently don't have. They must engage with in a very conscious manner. One example I'll give here that they can refer to is in the fintech sector or the finance sector in general. RBI has this account aggregator framework. That's been around for about 4 or 5 years now. That's a good one to look at in order to design consent, because that has a lot of similarities with how consent need to be designed. For example, basically if a bank or lender needs to verify your income, earlier they would make you submit a lot of physical documents, et cetera. Now in this framework, basically there's a intermediary which is called the account aggregator. They will take your request, basically take your consent, and then they will relay that consent to the financial information provider, which may be your bank or insurer or mutual fund. So the entity requesting your data will request it from you and hand it over. So it's kind of a relay thing. So something like that can be looked at. The framework already exists. It's working fairly well in the RBI framework. So that can be looked at for this. And the other important point I'll mention is that the digital exclusion problem. And that is that any consent framework that is designed exclusively for smartphone users will fail a significant portion of India's citizenry. Not everyone has smartphones. And for populations without that access, there has to be an offline consent channel with equivalent legal standing must be there. And these must be fed into the requisite digitization pipelines, so that we should not assume that everything just works on a smartphone and all of that. For example, a good framework to look at is our Jan Dhan Yojana account opening process, which is a good template for how consent is captured at scale in a low digital literacy context. That's actually worked pretty well. So that can be looked at also for DPDP. And last thing I'll mention is that the children's data, Section 9 of the DPDP Act, has a lot of provisions that has to be looked at for children's data. And without verifiable parental consent, you cannot process personal data of minors. So for example, our UDICE, Unified District Information System for Education, has over 260 million school children data. Ayushman Bharat Health Scheme also has millions of minor beneficiaries and so on and so forth. State education portals have huge amounts of student performance data, attendance records, etc. So all of these, most of these, as far as I know, do not have age verification or parental consent workflows. So all those government bodies who control this data will have to take some steps to comply with Section 9 of the DPDP Act. So to summarize, this question, to operationalize, if you do a checklist, you've got to start with the ROPA, map everything to Section 6 or 7, do a UI redesign with consent notices, etc., build a consent ledger, ensure downstream propagation, and make sure of children's data flow and those kinds of things.